Hi, my name is Kate,
And I'm Brandon.
and we're going to be talking about the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. So, for a little bit of background, it occurred on January 5th, 1919, and what happened was a molasses tank burst open and caused a wave of molasses to flood the streets of Boston. 2.3 million gallons of molasses filled the streets, and believe it or not, they were able to reach speeds as high as 35 miles an hour. This is in part because the molasses in the tank was a lot thinner than what we probably think of when we think of molasses, but still pretty catastrophic. It caused damage throughout many city blocks. People even became trapped in the molasses and had to be rescued. Once it escaped the tank, it kind of started to solidify and become more like what we would know as molasses, which made a lot of the damage even greater because it was a lot harder to clean up than if it were still kind of liquidy, like when it first exploded.
Yeah, and so obviously the failure was discovered pretty quickly. I mean, if a few million gallons of molasses is flooding down the street, you notice pretty much immediately. Witnesses reported the ground shaking and a loud roar, as well as machine gun-like sounds as the rivets flew past them. Um, the workers who were there at the tank saw some warning signs. There were some cracks and some molasses was even leaking out directly from the tank days before this occurred. But still, none of the workers thought to say anything or change anything because many of their higher ups were just not listening or didn't care.
So, as a result of this failure, there were 21 deaths and 150 injuries, as well as elevated railroad tracks buckling, buildings being crushed, and neighborhoods entirely covered in molasses. And over here, we have a little picture of Boston with some of the areas that the molasses covered. People were even swept into the Boston Harbor. Like, that's how far that molasses was able to stretch. It was pretty catastrophic, and the city of Boston suffered greatly as a result of it.
Yeah, and so obviously this is a huge disaster. So there's actually no like immediate technical investigation that occurred. There was no like federal organization that looked into these kind of things at this point. Only like small organizations, like independent organizations, or any party that was invested in the lawsuit that came after it. Those are the only people really looking into why this happened. Um, and as well, the victims and their families definitely wanted to know why this happened, what caused it, and who's at fault. And it took all the way until 2014 to have like an official investigation. There's been a few in the past decade or so, one by like Harvard and other independent investigators that looked back to all the technical documents and figured out what actually happened.
So there were a number of different things that are believed to have caused this failure. One of the biggest ones was that basic safety tests were completely neglected by the company. The tank was literally painted brown so that the general public couldn't see that molasses was leaking from the tank. That's how much negligence was existed with this tank. The walls of the tank were half as thin as they were supposed to be and contained low levels of manganese, which caused the material to be very brittle. And what all this ended up resulting in was a fatigue crack at the base of the tank. And once that crack became too much, the whole thing exploded. And that was the ultimate cause of the failure.
So yeah, so the party that ended up being at fault here is the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which is the owner of the tank. Um, and so after this, they never ended up rebuilding the tank. Their company probably went out of business. And like they had to go through so much trouble with the lawsuits and ended up having to pay $628,000 in damages, which is about $9.3 million today. And so clearly, this company should have never really been in business. They clearly had no safety regulation or regard for the safety of their workers. So the only good thing is that because of this, there's been so many laws put in place to prevent this from happening in the future and improving the oversight.
Yeah, so like Brandon was kind of saying, this lawsuit set precedent for many other class action worker lawsuits, and many engineering certification laws ended up being put in place after this flood. One of these things included the requirement that all plants or major structures be sealed by a registered professional engineer before a municipality or state would issue a building permit. So these types of laws and regulations help make sure that every single thing that's going to be built like this, a major structure, is undergoing those necessary safety precautions, making sure the materials used are durable enough that they're not going to undergo fatigue failure like what happened with the molasses tank. Making sure that nothing of this sort could ever happen again. Negligence was the primary cause, and so we are now working to make sure that negligence doesn't cause something this catastrophic in the future.
And today, this seems like a very, common sense thing to have. But, as if you've taken a history class that talks about this, you'll know that in the early 1900s, worker conditions were absolutely terrible. And this is just another example of that. So finally, the improvements we think should be made. Obviously, whoever made the design decisions and calculations for this tank were just not good. Like clearly, their factors of safety were not even correctly calculated, if at all, and they did not even consider any fatigue stresses. The tank, I believe, the tank failed only like 8 days after they'd started using it, which is just a complete lack of oversight on that. And so, to improve the design, obviously these factors need to be taken into account: the thickness of the tank, the everything else that goes into making sure the molasses can stay contained in the tank, which you think would be a relatively easy job, but now for the future, we know what not to do. So yeah, now here's our references, and yeah, thanks for listening.